Good afternoon and welcome to a CIEEM webinar on district level licensing for Great Crested Newts, eDNA survey and data collection. This webinar will be presented by Dr. Catherine Burgess from Natural England. Before I hand over to Catherine, I'd just like to mention a few of our upcoming events. So we have our autumn conference, which is in Llandudno on the 19th and 20th of November. And this will be on planning for success, maximising biodiversity through planning and strategic land use management. Just a side note that Natural England will be appearing at this conference to answer questions on district level licensing. And bookings for this event can be made on the training and events area of our website. We also have some upcoming training that you might be interested in. So we've got Protected Mammals Survey in Dunblane on the 23rd of October, Ecological Clerk of Works in Reading on the 31st of October, Developing Skills in Ecological Impact Assessment in Newport on the 12th and 13th of November, and Developing Skills in Ecological Impact Assessment in Dublin on the 27th and 28th of November. And again, these can be booked on the training events area on our website. An upcoming webinar that you may be interested in, so we've got one on amphibian entrapment in drains, a new approach to mitigation, and this will be on the Thursday the 7th of November at 12:30. We'd also like to mention that there is a series of district level licensing webinars, so the next one coming up after this will be on species modelling distribution on the Thursday the 30th of October at 12:30. Then the next one will be Habitat Delivery for Natural England led scheme on Tuesday the 5th of November at 12:30. And finally, there'll be one on district level licensing, how to apply, on Tuesday the 26th of November at 12:30. And these can all be booked again on the training events area on our website. So there will be a question and answer session at the end of this webinar. And if you'd like to submit a question, there should be a Q&A button at the top of your screen. So if you just click on that, type in your question and press send, and these will be answered at the end of the webinar. So I will now hand over to Catherine, who will host and present the webinar. Thank you, Catherine.
Brilliant. Thank you, Christy. Just get my screen up. Right. Okay. So thank you everyone for joining today. So as Christy mentioned, my name is Catherine Burgess, and I'm the evidence and data strategist for the district level licensing team at Natural England. Oh, sorry, seem to be having, oh, there we go. So apologies, some of you may have seen these slides already through the general district level licensing webinar that was given by a couple of my colleagues about sort of 2 weeks ago. But I think they give a really important context for the rest of the webinar, so I'm going to just go through them very quickly. So as many of you will know, Great Crested Newts are the biggest newt in the UK, and they can reach sizes of up to 17 centimetres. And this is a species that is distributed across all of Northern Europe. However, the populations in the UK are deemed internationally important. Despite these populations being internationally important, we are overall seeing a decrease in population trends according to the IUCN. It's currently illegal to capture, kill, injure or disturb great crested newts or damage their habitat without a licence. And the widely used traditional site-by-site mitigation licensing approach includes survey, trapping, fencing, translocation and compensation habitat created on sites. This results in those resources being concentrated on those individual sites to prevent losses. However, at the landscape scale, we continue to see those all-important great crested newt populations continue to decline. There's also downsides for developers with this current approach, in that they are constrained by uncertainty and also very specific seasonal timings for surveys and mitigation works. And this can lead to a lack of engagement by those developers in conservation efforts, which makes all of our lives as ecologists and conservationists incredibly difficult. So given these downsides to traditional licensing, Natural England has come up with a new innovative approach in the form of district level licensing. So district level licensing is more strategic and aims to provide targeted compensatory habitat in advance of impacts occurring. So this compensatory habitat is placed in more strategic locations in higher numbers. We aim to put in good quality ponds that are connected to pre-existing great crested newt populations throughout the landscape. These ponds will be securely managed and monitored over the long term, and this is all in line with what was suggested in the Lawton Review from 2010. So that's an overview to district level licensing in a nutshell, I suppose. And now I'm going to get on to the sort of the real focus of today's talk, which is data. So this is a very basic representation of how we get from data to a full-blown district level licensing strategy. So at the very top of the process, we have our great crested newt data coming in and also habitat data. And this gets fed directly into our species distribution model, which then produces ecological risk zones, strategic opportunity areas, and the impact assessment for a given area. And this goes into our district level licensing strategy for a given area. So today I'm going to be focusing on great crested newt data and to an extent some habitat data. And I'll pause there just to let Christy do a quick poll on current understanding of how we build our evidence base.
Thanks, Catherine. Yes, I'll now launch the poll. So hopefully you should all be able to see the poll now. And the question is, are you aware of how district level licensing scheme has gathered evidence to inform this new licensing approach? So either yes, no, or partially. I'll just give you a few more seconds to make your choices, and then I'll end the poll and share the results. Okay, so I'll end the poll now and share the results. So it's quite varied. Catherine, are you able to see the results?
Yes, yeah, I can.
Yeah. So 20% yes, 37% no, and 43% partially.
Brilliant, thank you.
No problem.
So as mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on how we built that evidence base today, along with how we got in some habitat data. But if you did want to know more about how that data then gets processed and used within our species distribution models, we've got that webinar coming up on the 30th of October, which will be led by my colleague, Dr. Ben Payne. So great crested newt data. Now this gets fed directly into our species distribution models, which are absolutely fundamental to our whole approach for district level licensing. However, robust models need a lot of data, and this is in the form of both species data and habitat data. So broadly speaking, this data, we need to have a lot of it. It needs to be at fairly fine spatial resolution because we're talking about newts who tend not to move very far from their ponds. And we need this data to be representative of where newts are found. We don't want it to be spatially biased in certain areas. We want to try and get data that is representative of all the habitats that they are present in throughout England. So approximately 54,000 ponds are occupied by great crested newts throughout England, which is around 20%. And that's a lot of ponds and a lot of data to gather. So we really need to try and use the best available evidence from both existing biological records and new survey data to get an idea of what that distribution actually looks like. So we have a wealth of already existing data for great crested newts, and this can be broadly classed into two categories from Natural England's point of view. So we have our own internal data sources in the form of class license returns and also previous survey results from our Great Crested Newt Evidence Enhancement Programme that took place in 2013. So both the class license returns and the Evidence Enhancement Programme data can be found in our open data portal. The web link is just at the bottom of this page here. And the class license returns can also be found on the NBN. And we can see that we get a fairly good distribution of records from those class license returns from the map on the right. But we're also fully aware that a lot of information exists with external groups. And these include groups like local environmental record centres, local amphibian and reptile groups, wildlife trusts, local planning authorities, the National GCN Surveillance Programme, which is currently running under PondNet and being run by the Freshwater Habitats Trust, and also HS2. So I've popped in some links there where you can find that information that is freely available. And you can also, for some local environmental record centres and local amphibian reptile groups and wildlife trusts, they do put information on the NBN, but it's usually at a reduced spatial resolution. So how did we go about starting to source these external records, given the number of these records that are out there and the number of groups that hold them? So a couple of years ago, we thought that a good place to start would be talking to the amphibian and reptile groups. So what we did here was we designed a survey for these groups, and this was coordinated centrally by ARG UK. And this was sent out to every single amphibian and reptile group within England, and included questions about how much data they held, at what resolution, what time period, and would they be willing to share this data with Natural England, and whether it was already shared with local environmental record centres. Now, the overwhelming message from that survey was that most amphibian and reptile groups do share their data with local environmental record centres, and this is where we've chosen to dedicate a lot of our efforts for getting that external data in. We've also had data supplied by HS2 and wildlife trusts and local planning authorities and local amphibian reptile groups and the National Surveillance Programme, but the vast majority has come from those local environmental record centres. The vast majority also of these external data sets are restricted data sets. So a lot of the time, these groups depend on that data for income. So we had to get in place some really robust data sharing agreements with these external groups. And these really varied in form depending on who we were getting data from, but there were two common themes amongst all data sharing agreements that we've made with these external groups. So the first one being that we won't share any of that raw data unless an FOI comes in, and getting the groups to agree to that condition was really important. And then also that we need to be able to share the derived outputs from using that raw data. So these include things like maps of our ecological risk zones and strategic opportunity areas. The map on the right just shows what areas we've managed to get external data from so far. We're still getting lots more external data in, but this is the current coverage. And we've acquired data from 20 external sources, and this comprises over 21,000 presence records for great crested newts. Now, of course, not all of these are usable, sort of depending on the resolution of that record and the time period that they cover and whether they're repeat surveys, but still 50% usable we were fairly happy with. And what we were starting to see when we were getting these external records in was that sometimes we were getting a bit of a spatial bias around these data sets. So you tend to see clusters of records around urban or semi-urban areas because simply it's linked to development, it's linked to those license returns. And the sort of map on the right demonstrates that. So I've tried to do this really sensitively without giving away any raw data for anywhere. So this is just from a local environmental record centre where we've sourced data from in the red dots, and you can see that clustering around that area right in the middle there. So we realised that to generate robust species distribution model, we really needed to get more data in that was representative of additional landscape types, and that we knew was recently collected. So to meet that above criteria, new survey data was absolutely needed. Now, new survey data could be generated for great crested newts in a number of ways, and I'm sure everyone listening will be very well versed in those number of ways, but very briefly, you can collect information on great crested newts through traditional survey methodologies, and this includes things like torch counts, bottle trapping, hand netting, egg searches, and belly pattern recognition. And the obvious pro to these approaches is that you can denote not just presence but also abundance and breeding activity, and you get a definitive answer on what's going on in that pond. There are a few limitations to it as well. Sometimes you're constrained by access to water bodies. There are animal welfare concerns to take into account. It can be incredibly labour intensive, and it's also costly. In comparison, you can also use a slightly newer methodology in the form of environmental DNA or eDNA. And this just requires a water sample from one visit using a standardized kit. This is a quick and affordable way to survey great crested newts, and the variation between labs is minimized through proficiency testing. The obvious limitation to this technique is that it can only denote presence at the moment, and that water chemistry elements can sometimes influence those results, and you can sometimes end up with inconclusive survey results, which is you wouldn't get that with a traditional survey methodology. However, despite these limitations, the affordability means that you can conduct a large number of surveys over a huge area relatively quickly. So this was the survey methodology that we chose to go with. And just a bit of background to eDNA. So eDNA is simply any DNA that is released from an organism, and it can be detected in water samples at incredibly low concentrations. So it's very good for detecting sort of rare and cryptic species. In aquatic environments, eDNA can also persist over a broad temporal period. So in the water column, it can persist for up to 3 weeks, depending on the conditions in that water body. And in the sediment, it can actually persist for a lot longer. However, the reason why we sample water instead of sediment for great crested newts is that you can actually, there's a much higher detection probability in water than in sediment. So once we decided on this methodology, we then needed to get planning. And I'm proud to say that over the past 3 years that Natural England have conducted the largest ever baseline survey for great crested newts using eDNA. So this was no small feat, and we had a dedicated access permissions team who were brilliant and called up thousands of landowners over these 3 years and asked for permission for us to come and survey their ponds. We made sure to include an open data clause in the phone script, and we saw this as absolutely integral in being able to share these survey results with the general public after they'd been collected. So this, the access permissions team were getting permissions for over 370 surveys per county-sized area. And briefly, the surveys themselves included an eDNA sample, and we only used labs that were undertaking proficiency testing at the time. So proficiency testing is an independent assessment of lab performance, and any lab conducting work for Natural England, eDNA work, sorry, for Natural England has to be undergoing proficiency testing. The surveyors were also collecting habitat suitability scores, and some surveyors were also collecting information on great crested newt breeding activity, the occurrence of other amphibians, and some water chemistry measurements. And you can see the sort of the brilliant coverage that we did get from those surveys over the past 3 years in that map on the right. So some summary statistics for how those surveys went. So in 2017, we started fairly small and we just conducted surveys throughout Cheshire. And that was 246 surveys, of which 84 great crested newts were present, which was a proportion of occupied ponds of 34.6%. In 2018, we really scaled up the efforts and conducted 2,569 surveys across 44 districts spanning 12 counties. Of those surveys, 870 had great crested newts present, so that's a proportion of occupied ponds of 34.9%. And then in 2019, we really scaled up again. So we conducted 3,618 surveys across 79 districts and 24 counties in 2019. And of those surveys, 917 recorded great crested newts as present, which led to a proportion of occupied ponds of 27.9%. So I thought I'd also pull out some headline results from those surveys, and we hope to have this survey information released very sort of in the near future. Unfortunately, it wasn't available before this talk today. But once these results are released, they're free for anyone and everyone to interrogate how they wish. But just some very brief headlines from that survey data over the past 3 years. So HSI was fairly consistent across the 2017, 2018, and 2019 areas. However, there were a much higher proportion of breeding activity in 2018. And I'm not sure this is directly comparable to the lower breeding activity in 2019, because obviously we went to different areas, but it certainly does match up with what the National Surveillance Programme were finding, and that there was much higher levels of breeding activity of great crested newts in 2018 compared to 2019. So in 2018, the highest GCN occupancy of ponds was found in Essex, and they were found present in 46.7% of all ponds surveyed. The lowest occupancy was in the northwest of England, where the occupancy rate was 23.4%. The highest habitat suitability index, highest average, habitat suitability index score was for the southwest of England at 0.68, and the lowest habitat suitability index was for the southeast of England at 0.6. For 2019, the highest great crested newt occupancy rate was in Herefordshire and Worcestershire at 45.5%, and the lowest occupancy was in Northwest Yorkshire at 17.6%. The highest average HSI was found in the northeast of England at 0.68, and the lowest HSI was in the south and southeast of England at 0.62. So that data's the existing and the new survey data really is incredibly important at scheme generation and goes directly into that overall district level licensing strategy. But I also wanted to highlight that we will absolutely have new data coming into district level licensing at a later date, and this will be instrumental in the adaptive management of the scheme. So the way we're monitoring district level licensing compensation ponds, we're using the funds which is paid by the developer, and 85% of those funds goes directly towards habitat creation, monitoring and maintenance. So part of this fund will go towards 4 eDNA and HSI surveys for all our compensation ponds that are in the ground, 3 management and maintenance visits, which also include an extra HSI survey, and will contribute to the sustainability of the National Monitoring Programme for Great Crested Newts under PondNet. And also a subset of ponds will also undergo population counts. And below is just a nice photo of one of those compensation ponds that has been dug. So this is in Kent, and you can see what a brilliant job our people on the ground have done with restoring that pond to its new glory. So given that we'll be conducting a large number of eDNA and HSI surveys and also population counts at our compensation ponds, this is going to generate a huge amount of new survey data for the district level licensing project and also for broader research uses. And just to get an idea of how much data that will actually be, so we currently have 51 ponds in the ground in Kent and 29 in Cheshire, and all of those will undergo at least 4 eDNA and HSI surveys. And we also have had a recent tender close for the habitat creation of 251 ponds up and down the country. And those will also all be surveyed for eDNA and HSI at least 4 times through their lifespan. The vast majority of this monitoring data will also be made open access on the Natural England Open Data portal, depending of course on landowner permissions, but we hope to secure landowner permissions for the majority of that data so that we can release it easily. So in summary, how we've built our robust evidence base for district level licensing. So we've used internal data, and this has been in the form of new data from our eDNA survey efforts, which have comprised 1,871 presence records throughout England from 2017 to 2019. And we'll also be generating new survey data on our compensation ponds over the ongoing lifetime of the district level licensing scheme. We've also utilised existing data, and this includes over 27,000 presence records from class licence records and 291 presence records from our Great Crested Newt Evidence Enhancement Programme from 2013. In terms of our external data, we've managed to gather in over 21,000 presence records from across 20 different stakeholders and lots of different groups over the past 3 years, some of which is available for you to interrogate for yourselves. And this has resulted in a grand total of over 50,000 presence records for Great Crested Newts that we've been able to utilise within the district level licensing scheme. So I'm going to stop there, and Christy's going to pose another poll to you all.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. So I'll launch the second poll now, which should be available on your screens. So the question is, did the webinar help with your knowledge around the evidence base that underpins district level licensing? So I'll just give you a couple of seconds to make your decision. Okay. Okay, and I will end the poll there and share the results with you. So hopefully, Catherine, you can see that that's an overwhelming yes.
That's a fantastic result. Thanks, everyone.
Perfect, thank you.
And yeah, so that's the end of my talk, and more than happy to try and answer any questions you might have.
Great, thanks, Catherine. So before we move on to the Q&A, if I just share with you all how to record this webinar, what competencies to use to record the webinar. So you can use environmental management, policy, legislation and standards, and scientific methods. Okay, so we'll now move on to the Q&A, and it looks like we've got a couple of questions already. So Matthew asks, what is the evidence that GCN populations in UK and Europe are declining? Is it direct evidence or assumed due to known pond and habitat loss? Eve?
Yes, yes.
That. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just on mute still. Thanks, Matthew. So in terms of the evidence that IUCN have used to assess that, it will be a bit of a mixture of both direct evidence from lost populations, mainly throughout Northern Europe, I believe, but also the habitat loss and making a decision based on those evidence bases. And they've used, so they'll have certain baselines that they use taken from a certain time, but they'll also be mining a lot of data from places like the NBN, from the scientific literature, and also from grey literature. So it's a real mishmash of how the IUCN gather that evidence in. But I believe if you go on to the Great Crested Newt page, they'll have a long list of all the evidence that they've used to make that decision.
Thank you, Catherine. Another question from Matthew. Have you only used presence data for modelling or absence as well?
We've predominantly used the presence data. So each species distribution model is slightly different depending on the area, but and my colleague Ben Payne will be going into more detail with this in a couple of weeks' time. But we predominantly use pseudo absences simply because so we gather in our own survey data, and we have that absence data associated with the eDNA method. But usually when we get in data from external sources, it's overwhelmingly presence data, and there's very few absences, which leads to a bias in the model. And it's also, if you sort of think about it, an absence result doesn't necessarily mean that newts are absolutely absent. It kind of just denotes more of an unknown. You have to survey over a number of different time periods over a number of years to really determine absolutely that absence. So we use predominantly presence records in our modelling, but then also use pseudo absences as well.
Thank you. Another question from Anna. What proportion of ponds in any district were surveyed?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I'm afraid off the top of my head, I wouldn't be able to say for every single district. But when we release this data, which hopefully will be over the next couple of weeks or so, it'll be open for everyone to interrogate for their districts of interest, and you can compare that with, I believe there's some elements of the pond layer that are open source from OS. So it really did depend on which district and those landowner permissions, and it's a really varied amount throughout all our different survey areas.
Great, thank you. Lynn asks, there seemed to be no eDNA survey for Kent.
So we did undertake eDNA surveys for Kent, but those were part of the GCN Evidence Enhancement Programme in 2013. So that information is on the Natural England Open Data portal. And then in terms of how we informed our model for Kent in recent times, we ended up sourcing data from the Kent amphibian and reptile group instead of undertaking eDNA surveys there. So it's just it's a bit of a different approach for acquiring the evidence base for Kent. We were working with the Kent ARG group, who did hold a lot of information on great crested newt distribution in Kent.
Great, thank you. Another question, is population size taken into consideration at some stage during district level licensing?
Yes, I might hand over to Gregor for that one, because it is taken into account, but at a slightly different stage.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. I'm Gregor Neve from Natural England. I'm a technical lead in the district licensing team. You may have heard me speak on the webinar we did a couple of weeks ago. So yes, we do take population size into account when we're looking at classification of red zones in our risk mapping. So we require population survey information over about 3 years when we're looking at classifying a red zone. And in the process itself, we require presence or absence data only, but the volume and quality of habitat that we're providing as compensation is sufficient to compensate for losses of populations at a site level. And again, we're looking at gains at a landscape scale measured according to the to certain parameters: range, distribution, population, habitat, future prospects, rather than at a site level.
Great, thank you, Gregor. So we have another question. What does the remaining 15% of the developer's contribution go towards?
And I might let Gregor answer that one too. Thanks, Gregor.
Hello again. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's administration, receiving inquiries, administering the scheme and that sort of stuff. But what I can say is it does quite a big proportion of that 15% goes to a project officer, and that project officer will sit with a habitat delivery body. So again, in Cheshire, we're working in Cheshire West with the local council there. So they have some funding to go to a project officer there. And in Cheshire East, we're working with the Cheshire Wildlife Trust. So it's the same there. So it's put down as administration, but actually it should be something positive. It's a project officer working with landowners and trying to improve conservation of newts.
That's great, thank you. Question from Diane. Do you think the drop in GCN numbers in 2019 could be attributed to the drought in 2018?
I think on some levels, absolutely. So it's important to bear in mind that we obviously surveyed different areas in 2019 compared to 2018, and some of those areas sort of right up in the northern bits of England, especially sort of northeast. We know that occupancy of ponds in that area isn't as high for great crested newts, but certainly when we're comparing our results, so one of the reasons why district level licensing is putting funds towards the national surveillance program is that it can give us incredibly useful background information and put our surveys into context. So for the 2019 surveys, the national surveillance program under PondNet did also find that occupancy was slightly less compared to previous years. 2018 was a booming year for great crested newt occupancy of ponds, and they found that up and down the country. And then there was a distinct dip in 2019. And I do believe that information is available on PondNet's website. So I do think it can be attributed to drought, and we certainly had, whilst we got the sample numbers that we needed, we faced a real uphill battle with trying to find enough ponds to survey in 2019, because by the time the surveyors were out, even in early May, a lot were either completely dry or there was just too little water to survey. So I think part of it could be attributed to that drought, but also bearing in mind it was different areas that were surveyed compared to 2018.
That's great, thank you. Martin asks, why do you think HSI is the lowest in Southeast England?
Oh, that's a really good question. So again, we sort of compared and contrasted our HSI results to what's been found for the National GCN Surveillance Programme, which also looks at HSI. And actually they found the same thing as well, that pond quality in the southeast of England tends to be a little lower than the rest of the country. And they've started looking a bit more into this. So The National Surveillance Scheme has also started measuring nitrates and phosphates in pond water, and found that the pond quality, so much higher rates of nitrates and phosphates in the southeast compared to other areas. So I guess we could say it was that, but I'm afraid the district level licensing surveys couldn't definitively say that. But again, we can put that in the broader context of what's been found in that national surveillance scheme.
Thank you. Leo asks, how come Kent? Oh no, you've answered this one, I think. Yeah, ignore that one. Andrew asks, the Wildlife Trust estimate there to be 500,000 plus ponds in the UK. Your GCN occupancy rate appears to be based on a much smaller number. Can you explain the difference?
Oh, I'd have to look at the difference in those numbers. The GCN occupancy rate stated at the beginning of the presentation was taken from the scientific literature, and it is from 2011, so it may well have been revised by the Wildlife Trust since that 2011 publication.
Great, thank you. Anna asks, with no information available regarding population size, what assumptions does Natural England make when providing compensation, i.e. is a precautionary approach adopted?
I'll hand this one over to Gregor.
Hello. Yeah, so at every step in the process, a precautionary approach is taken. So, for example, assuming newts are on site, if you haven't got survey information to say they are or aren't, is an example of that. If your development boundary sits in a green zone where we predict it's unlikely for newts to be, but it just clips an orange zone or an amber zone, then we'll automatically consider it to be sort of an amber impact, and compensation will be provided on as such. It's again that the webinar we did, the first webinar we did, we tried to go into a certain amount of detail around this, but there are so many steps involved in the development of the process for how we administer the licensing. All I can do on this call is assure you that we have been precautionary at every step. Whether there's a chance to be precautionary, we have been. I hope that helps.
That's great, thank you. Tracy asks, will you be looking to fill the county gaps?
So in terms of where there are county gaps, so these will relate to probably where district level licensing isn't going to be rolled out, simply because there isn't much of a need for it in terms of the number of and that's decided through the number of license returns that are sort of specifying that are great crested newts and that development pressure on newts. So we're trying to, with where we've surveyed, divert resources to where we think is most likely there'll be uptake of district level licensing. In terms of going forward and generating that new survey data, again, the National Surveillance Scheme has a fairly good spread of sites throughout the country. So there'll always be information coming in nationally on great crested newt trends, but no, there are no further plans to go out and survey those counties that we haven't already, simply because we don't feel that there's a need for it at this moment in time.
Perfect, thank you. Anna says, I noticed that the lowest HSI scores were generally greater than 0.6. Is this as lower scoring ponds were emitted?
So I probably should have been a bit more clear in the talk. So we absolutely had lower HSI scores than 0.6, but those were just average scores taken from those broader areas to try and highlight those trends. When we're able to get this survey data out, which is hopefully will be over the next couple of weeks, everyone will be able to interrogate that data and see actually where those lower scoring ponds were, and indeed the higher scoring ponds. But I'll make sure to put actually ranges on my next presentation. That's a good tip.
Great, thank you. Somebody asked, is there an underlying reason why the Northwest gave the lowest GCN presence in the surveys undertaken?
Ooh, off the top of my head, it might not be the only reason, but certainly one of the reasons might well be lower pond densities. So we find that there's a huge correlation with great crested newt presence and pond densities within each kilometre square. So that could be one of the reasons, but again, there are lots of other things like soil types, other species that are present that might also contribute. It's unlikely to be just one factor, but I would say pond density would be an important one.
Great, thank you. Lynn asks, what happens at the end of the 25-year maintenance and monitoring period?
And I'll hand that to Gregor, that one.
Hello. Well, hopefully it will continue, but maintenance and monitoring will continue. But essentially, the funding at that point that we've received from the developers runs out after 25 years. So there's no reason to expect why. So again, I'll use Cheshire as an example. In Cheshire East, if Cheshire Wildlife Trust, our habitat delivery body there, and they're maintaining and monitoring ponds over 25 years, they are a wildlife trust and they have conservation at their heart. So there's no reason to think why that there wouldn't be efforts to continue to monitor and maintain those ponds in the long term after that point.
That's great, thank you. Matthew asks, how does district licensing circumvent the legal issue of killing and injuring GCN at the site level?
I think that might be in my court too. So we issue, as Natural England, we issue a license under the Habitats Regulations, which allows killing and injury of newts under district licensing. But that's only as long as sufficient compensation is provided and maintained over 25 years. So we have to be absolutely certain that that the impact of killing and injury can be compensated, and that the conservation status of newts over in a certain place will be maintained. But it's likely that it'll be enhanced as well. The sheer volume of habitat we're providing ponds, it's huge, and we're securing funding up front, so those ponds are maintained and monitored, so we can see what's going on. We can also predict what's going on at a landscape scale through the modelling, which Catherine's touched on, and our colleague Dr. Ben Payne will go into on the 30th of October. So for the first time ever, we can predict where newts are likely to be, and we can then overlay development allocations data from local plans, and we can see where those impacts are likely to be as well. So we can do some really good stuff, but to be able to do that, we are issuing licenses for killing and injury, but only where we are certain that we can compensate for those impacts.
Great, thank you. Another question, how are animals protected when development sites are cleared under DLL?
I think that falls with me as well. So I've just said, we do issue a license under the HABS regs to allow killing and injury, but we don't want that. And so there's developer guidance that's available. So we'd expect developers to use that guidance and working with their ecologists to try and reduce harm on that site. But if in the unfortunate event that there is killing or injury on that site, it means that developer it doesn't fall foul of the law.
Great, thank you. Another question, is there scope for newts to be moved into these new areas from development sites? But I think you've kind of answered that. Yeah, so although, yes, there is scope for that. We're not advocating it. It's not a necessary thing. We're working on the assumption that we're putting ponds in the right places, and newts will find those ponds and that habitat of their own accord. But there's nothing to stop newts being moved from sites to these new ponds or other ponds nearby. Great, thank you. Another question from Marsden. Have you monitored and took into account GCN relocation, if any, in your data analysis?
So we have tried to, and sometimes that information can be a little ambiguous when we get it in. So a way to get around that is to to use recent records, which is what we do in the vast majority of cases, unless there's evidence to suggest that nothing has changed on that particular site. So yes, we do take it into account, and we hope that we have the most up-to-date location of those great crested newt populations by really focusing on those recent records.
Thank you. Another question, is this guidance legally binding?
So in the Lateral England-led approaches, it isn't legally binding. No. So it is guidance, but it's there to be used, and local authorities have the opportunity to include it as planning conditions if they wish. But if you're relying on the licensing itself, no, it's not a legally binding thing.
Thank you. Another question, it looks to be our last, but it might not be. How will DLL coincide with biodiversity net gain, i.e. if ponds and associated newt populations are removed, will DLL, essentially off-site mitigation, comply with BNG?
Catherine, shall I take this one?
Yes, yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, so it can work alongside biodiversity net gain, and so our district licensing team and our net gain team, we're working together and producing a position statement with DEFRA at the moment, so that will hopefully be available soon. But essentially, this is a licensing approach, and so it should be considered as such. But if you're providing, if you're losing ponds and you're providing ponds off-site, you can measure that using the metric version 2 net gain metric, just using their metric. So we talk about quite a lot net gain for newts or enhancement for newts, and so we can measure certain things, and one of the simple ones is numbers of ponds, and so we operate to for every one occupied pond lost, it's a rule in district licensing that we have to provide 4 new compensation ponds in the right places and monitored and maintained for 25 years. So that's a metric for measuring net gain for district licensing. But you can use a separate metric, so the DEFRA metric 2, net gain metric 2, to measure any losses on site, and also any gains off site, measuring the district licensing ponds, if that makes sense. So you can use both metrics together, but you wouldn't want to, and you shouldn't, measure net gain through the metric we're using for district licensing, or vice versa. That's probably as clear as mud, but they do work. They do and can work alongside each other.
Thank you very much. We've had a few more questions come in. Rachel asks, what incentives are for the developers to follow any guidelines to protect great crested newts during site clearance when they have a license for killing and injury?
So again, I hope there'll be the developers normally working with ecologists, and there'll be other protected species on site, and so there'll be other constraints to think about. So there aren't incentives as such, and this licensing process is designed with newt conservation at the heart. But to be able to get there, we were needed to be able to make the system as simple as possible for developers on site. So if they do happen to, if their actions happen to result in killing or injury, they have a license to make sure that they don't fall foul of the law. But we're using the developer guidance isn't there for no reason at all. It's there because we expect developers, or hope developers will use it, especially in conjunction with when working alongside their ecologists.
That's great, thank you. Lynn asks, presumably new ponds are being created within range of existing populations and with suitable connectivity.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And our colleague Ben Payne will go into sort of more details on how we identify the best areas to put those compensation ponds, but very briefly, we do absolutely take into account where existing populations are, and suitable landscape types for where those new ponds should go, and are they within a reasonable distance from existing populations that either we have records for, but of course we're using a model as well. So just because there are gaps in where those presence records are doesn't mean that there aren't newts there. We just simply haven't got information for them yet. So some ponds will be in suitable landscape types where we think there should be newts, but maybe we haven't got those presence records quite yet. So it'll be a real mixture of where those ponds are going, but we will be prioritizing efforts around those known sites so that we can get colonization in our compensation ponds.
That's great, thank you. Final question, what is the spending split between the initial pond cost and the maintenance? 3 maintenance visits in 25 years seems rather light unless these are fairly major.
So our webinar from a couple of weeks ago has been recorded, and on that recording, that's on YouTube now, I think, if that's right, Christy.
Yes.
And on that, you'll see our cost breakdown there. So that we spent a long time thinking about how much money we need, how many times we need to go back, how many monitoring visits, all that sort of stuff. And so 3 monitoring visits was considered sufficient. So it's maybe 1 monitoring visit every 7 to 8 years, and that's that. And if you think about if you've created a new pond, what's going to happen in 7 to 8 years to that pond? And it's likely to be scrub encroachment. That's going to be the main thing. Other things might happen, but it's likely to be scrub encroachment. So we've got a budget there. So it's a maintenance visit. So to go and have a look at the pond, do the HSI, do an egg search as well at the same time, but also to do a second visit if a maintenance action is needed. So that would cover something like scrub clearance, and getting rid of that scrub afterwards. It might even cover dredging if the pond is silting up. But if the pond is silting up in that amount of time, the design of the pond is probably slightly flawed. So we're hoping to see that early on during our 4 monitoring visits after that pond has been created. If we start to see that pond isn't acceptable, it might be that we write it off, and then we have to find a spare pond instead. So if at any point we think that pond is failing and can't be brought back into a good state for great crested newts, we'll cross that one off our spreadsheet, and we'll bring in a different pond and make sure that there's enough ponds as contingency against failure of those initial ones. So it's also worth saying that it's an ongoing process, and we're revising not just the scheme, but also the costs as we go along. So the costs at the moment, we think are good, and our delivery bodies that we're working with have signed up to those costs, and they think they're okay and manageable. But if there's evidence to show that it isn't enough or is too much, for example, then we can revise those costs upwards or downwards as we see fit.
That's good. That's great. Thank you, Gregor. I believe that's all of the questions. So we'll end the Q&A session there. Thank you both very much. And thank you to everyone that's joined us today. We will be sending out a feedback form. So please do fill that in. Apologies, my screen has disappeared. Yeah, so please do that, fill that feedback form in, and that will inform our future webinars. And yes, thank you again to everyone for joining us, and thank you to Catherine and Gregor for a great webinar, and we hope that you will join us again soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, bye-bye.